Hey, what's up everyone and welcome to Daily Code Buffer. In this video, we are going to learn about the OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect in detail with example. So without wasting any time, let's get started. So in this video, what we will do is we will understand what is OAuth 2.0 and what is OpenID Connect, how we can use both of them with the Spring Security and Spring Boot, and how we can create a cohesive application where we have the login functionality with the help of Authorization Server, Resource Client, and all the different components. So what we'll do is we'll create one application where we want to call the Authorization Server. That particular API that we are going to create, that has to be authenticated, then only we will be able to access the APIs. Without authentication, we won't be able to access the APIs. And to make that possible, we will be using the Authorization Server. So we'll be creating our custom Authorization Server which will handle all the authorization requests. And if there is any APIs that are behind the Authorization Server, suppose resource servers, right? So there are resources that we want to connect after the authentication from our client. So that also we are going to create, and it will be handled using the Authorization Server with the OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect. So this type of functionality you would have seen at many places. If you go to any of the websites, and you might have seen the button like login with Google, login with Twitter, login with GitHub, and all the other things, right? So this type of implementation is possible using the OAuth 2.0, where you will give the authorization of your application to a client, like that particular client can use your application. So we'll be providing the consent to the client, like, okay, you are authorized to use this on behalf of this particular user, so you can use this particular application. So that's what we are going to build today. So we are going to see everything in detail in the demonstration. And if you are interested in any kind of path-based learning where there is a predefined path available and you can learn those particular things, then you can check out the educative.io. In the educative.io, there are different paths available, and within those paths there are different modules available. You can learn all those particular modules and you can complete your path and you can get the certifications. There are paths such as machine learning engineering, DevOps engineering, full stack application developer, system design expert, and many more. So if you are interested, I'll add the first link in the description below for you to check out. Now let's get back to the video. So before we implement the login functionality, we need to understand about the OAuth 2.0. So you might have seen this OAuth 2 implemented at many places. So everywhere you go, you will be seeing this particular buttons to log in with those particular authentication providers. There will be Okta, Auth0, and many things. Okay, so these are all the authentication providers based on the OAuth 2.0 standards. Now before we implement anything, we need to understand about the OAuth 2.0. So OAuth 2.0, which means open authorization, is a standard designed to allow websites or application to access resources, okay, hosted anywhere on behalf of the user. So it's like very simple. If I give you the analogy, I have my mobile phone, okay, and if you want to use my mobile phone, you have to take permission from me to use that particular phone. That's a simple thing. So that's the analogy that we are going to understand from there. So I have my phone, that means I have my resources, I have my APIs. If you want to access it, you need to take the permission from me to use those APIs or to use my mobile phone. Okay, so that's the standard that has been OAuth 2.0. So OAuth 2.0 is just the authorization protocol and not the authentication. So it only provides the authorization, like you are allowing someone to use your resources. I am just allowing you to use my phone. Okay, simple things. It's just the authorization that you can access this. But what about the authentication? That authentication comes later when you connect OpenID with it. Okay, so OAuth 2.0 and OpenID connects together and you will get the complete authentication and authorization working together. Now the other important part of the OAuth 2.0 is it is designed primarily as a means of granting access to a set of resources. Suppose you have a set of resources, like if you take the example of a Twitter has its own API. If you want to access those APIs, you need to request for it, right? You will be requesting Twitter to use it, okay, and the Twitter will give you some extra details about authorization, client ID, and all those tokens and everything to use those APIs. So it's just like that. And OAuth 2.0 uses access tokens. So we will go in detail about the access tokens and how everything works, but this is a basic idea about it. Now in OAuth 2.0, these are the basic jargons that you need to understand, because everywhere this will be the thing that we will be talking about, that is the resource owner, client, authorization server, and resource server. Entire OAuth 2.0 depends on this, and you will be implementing this only. Let's understand resource owner. What is resource owner? A user or system that owns the protected resources and can grant access to them. I just give you the example, right? I have my phone and I am the sole owner of that particular phone because it's my phone. Okay, and if you want to use it, I can grant you access and you have to ask for me. So that's the resource owner. Now the client. The client is the system that requires access to the protected resources. You, my friend, you are the client because you want to access my phone, right? So a client will need the access from the resource owner. And here you can see that client must hold the appropriate access token. If you want to access my phone, you need to have my password, right? So that is something that the access token will be given to you. So that's the resource owner and the client. Now the next is the authorization server. So this is the server receives requests from the client for access token and issues them upon the successful authentication and consent by the resource owner. So it's something very simple, right? Authorization server what it will do is it will just give you the token on behalf of the request that you are giving. Okay, authorization server is nothing but to authorize your request. It will just check that are you authorized to use that particular resources that you are trying to use, and once the consent for that is given by the owner, resource owner, then authorization server will allow you to use those particular resource. That's a simple thing. And the resource server, a server that protects users resources and receives access request from the client. It accepts and validates the access token from the client and returns the appropriate resources to it. So it will just try to handle, or it will have all the resources. So it will try to handle all the resources, and if any of the request comes with the proper authorization, with the proper code, then it will allow the client to use those resources. Otherwise it will decline the request. So these are the terms, these are the main terms that we are going to implement. We will be implementing the authorization server, we are going to implement the resource server, and we are going to implement the client. So whatever the application that we are going to build, the APIs that we are going to build, that will be your client. So with that particular client, we will be implementing the authorization server and the resource server. So everything works together and your request will be authenticated. Now if you go back to the IntelliJ idea, if you see here, this is your Spring Security Client. This is your project where you have the different APIs, right? Whatever we have created. So these are the APIs that is your client, and this particular clients, whenever you are doing any requests, you might need the access from the authorization server or the resource server whenever you want to create any of the things. It's simple as that, right? So we have to create the authorization server, and all this authorization will be handled from your database. Okay, if you go to the database, these are the users that we have, right? Shabir and Nikhil currently. So all your authorization will be validated against this particular users. We will be passing the user details. It will handle these user details, and once the users are validated, we will be allowing the resource to use. And the next thing that we have to understand is the scopes. Scopes are important concept because scopes exactly defines what you are allowed to use. Okay, suppose you are not the admin, so you are just the user, then you have only rights to read the data. If you are admin, you have some rights to modify the data as well. So all these particular things are defined based on the scopes of the application. Okay, scopes for the particular user, and all these particular scopes you will have to give the consent to use those particular scopes. So it's very simple. Like if you are going to any of the websites and there is a button to log in with Google, when you hit on that button log in with Google, you will be redirected back to the Google page, and where you will be entering your credentials. Once you enter the credentials, you are authenticated by Google, and after that you will be displayed the scopes. Like these are the permissions that your client is asking, right? To read your name, to read your email ID, to read your profile picture. These are the different scopes they have defined. So it's asking the consent from you that a particular client is asking all these particular details from me, and if you hit allow, then only the consent is accepted and the particular client is allowed to use those resources. It's similar thing. So these are scopes. And if you see this particular flow over here, so this is just the abstract flow. There are different particular variations available based on the different grant types, and the flow will be changed accordingly. So the ideal flow would be like you have the client, your application, your user, that is the resource owner, your authorization server, and your resource server, and this is your service APIs entirely on top of the authorization server and the resource server. Whenever application wants to use anything, application will create the authorization request to the user, to the resource owner, like I want to use this particular resources, and user will grant the access. Like you grant the access when you click on the Gmail, right? After login to the Gmail. So you gave the grant like, okay, you can use those resources to the client. Now client got the consent like, okay, I am allowed to use those resources. Then client will send that grant to the authorization server. Okay, I got the request. Okay, I got the permission now. Okay, this is the permission. So what authorization server will do is, okay, it will validate. Okay, you got the request, you got the code, now take this token. So authorization server is giving token back based on the code that we got as the grant. Okay, so now the token is given back to the client after validation. Now with this particular token, the application or the client will hit the server to get the details. So once that particular token is valid, until that particular token is valid, so resource server will allow those requests. If the token is not valid, resource server will not allow those requests. It's a simple flow. This particular things you need to understand, that is the client, resource owner, resource server and the authorization server. This is how everything will work together. Now we'll go to the application and we will implement the authorization server, and we will connect our client with the authorization server, and we will also create the resource server. So if there is any resources that we have created behind the authorization server, then user can use those. So let's go to the IntelliJ IDEA. Okay, we have one client available, and this particular client has a controller, and you can see that there is one API get mapping /hello. So this particular request should be allowed only if you are logged in. Now let's implement the authorization server. So we need to create the new authorization server application. So let's do that. So now if you want to understand this flow, you can go to the OAuth Playground. Okay, OAuth 2.0 Playground, this one. Okay, and from here you can understand that particular flow. So here you can see that there are different flows available. There's a different types of implementation that you can do: authentication code, PXE, implicit, device code, OpenID Connect, and anything. Okay, generally authorization code or the OpenID Connect with PXE would be more implemented. So let's try to understand the simple authorization flow. I'll add the link in the description below so you can check this out. I'll go to the authorization flow. And here you can see that it is asking to register a client first. Okay, client means your API from where you're going to access. Okay, before you can begin the flow, you will need to register a client and create a user. Simple thing. So let's register a client. Okay, in order to use the OAuth API, you will need to first register application. If you go through this, right, if you go through this entire flow, you will get a much more understanding about the OAuth 2 flow. So I'll highly recommend you to go through this particular flow as well, so you will get more understanding. So let's register this client. Okay, and here you can see that you got the client registration data. So it's similar to how you will be registering your application to any of the OAuth 2 providers like Google, GitHub, LinkedIn, or whatever. Like whatever the OAuth 2 providers are there, you have to register your application and you will get the client ID, client secret. Let me just open this in a new window, and these are the client registration. So let me just continue and register this client to the OAuth 2. Okay, and here you can see that this is the first flow: build the authorization URL and redirect the user to the authorization server. And currently this way the authorization URL will be built. So your authorizationserver.com, whatever the authorization server is, /authorize. So /authorize this. So these are the standard APIs. Okay, these are the standard APIs from the OAuth 2.0. Wherever you will be implementing this will be the standard URLs. If you want to modify, you can modify, but these are the standards. And with this authorize, you will be passing more parameters. That is the response type. What type of response type it is? It's code. So because we have started with the authorization code flow, the response type is code. Okay, if for the different flow, this particular value would be different. And you can see the client ID, and client ID equals to client ID that we got, and the redirect URI. This redirect URI is nothing but once the authentication is done, where you want to redirect back. So that particular URI we need to define. And the scope. So these are the scopes that we talked about earlier, like what should be the scope of the access that you want to grant. So that scope, and this particular state. You can see that this state is the parameter. The client will need to store this to use in the next step. Okay, so this state also will be generated. So these are the standard parameters that will be generated to authorize your request. So let's authorize this request against the OAuth server, and here we need to add our credentials. So these are our credentials. So let me just copy the username, and this is the password. Okay, Once we log in, it will be authorized. And here you can see that now it is asking for the consent. Okay, that do you approve or not. So we will approve. And here you can see that verify state parameter. And here you can see that it is checking the earlier state and the current state. After redirection, the states are same. If it matches, then continue. If it doesn't matches, then what is the flow? So you can check both the flows. So let's continue with the it matches, continue. So you can see that once this matches, the next is the exchange the authorization code. So after that, whatever the code we got, right, we need to hit this token URI to get the token. So here you can see that the grant type equals to authorization code. We are passing the client ID. We are passing the client secret. Okay, whatever the client secret it was. We are passing the redirect URI, and also we are passing the code. Okay, whatever the code we got from the above step. So once we hit on go, against this authorization code and all the details, we will get the token, and that is the token that we have to use. So once we click on go, at the end you can see that we got the token. This is the access token for your resources from your client. So you can see that there is a refresh token. The scope is also defined. What is the scope of this token? It's a barrier type. Okay, when it expires. So all this information is there. So you can try for the another flow as well, and you can check it out how everything is working. So this is a general idea how this OAuth 2 will work, and similarly we will be implementing in our system. So now let's go to the Spring initializer. Okay, start.spring.io, and let's create the authorization server. So let me just add the group ID com.daily code buffer, and the artifact I'll give is auth authorization server. The package name I'll give auth server. Okay, packaging is jar, Java version is 11, and let's add the dependencies. So I'll add the Lombok dependency. I'll add the JPA dependency as we need to connect to the database. I'll add the MySQL driver. I'll add the security, and I'll add the web dependency. So these are the dependencies that I'm adding in my authorization server. So let's generate the project and add in the IntelliJ IDEA. So I'm just generating the project. Let's open in the Finder, unzip it. Let's copy this. We'll go to Documents, Java Workspace, Spring Security, and I'm adding over here. Okay. Now this should be added to the IntelliJ IDEA. And if I go to my parent, that is Spring Security tutorial, let me add the module OAuth 2 authorization server. Okay, here you can see that OAuth authorization server is imported. I'll be using the services. Now within this authorization server, okay, we need to add one more dependency, that is the authorization server. So let me just go down over here in the dependency section. Let me add the dependency, that is the Spring Security OAuth 2 authorization server. The version that we are using is 0.2.2. So this will allow us to create the authorization server. Now for this authorization server, let's go to the Java main resources. Let's change the properties files to YAML. And let's change the server port, server.port to 9000. Okay, so I'm just changing the port. And for this, as we are going to use the JPA with the same database, I need to add the configuration details for the same. So let me just go to the Spring Security client. I'll go to the resources application.yaml. Let me copy this detail, and let me go to application.yaml and paste this. Simple, right? I'm just using the same MySQL localhost 3306 user registration schema, username password as root, class name provided, and show SQL is equal to true. So all these details are there. Now for this particular authorization server as well, we need to use this user registration and the user flow, right? So we need to have the user entity, user repository, and the user services that we have defined in the Spring Security client to my authorization server as well. Ideally, if there is any duplicate files that you have to use, so you can separate out all those particular files in a separate project and you can use that particular project's dependency in your pom.xml file. You can go ahead that way also, but currently let's directly use those. So in my Java folder, let me create the packages. I'll create the package entity service repository config. So I need the user entity, so let me just copy this and paste it over here. Then I need the user repository, so let me just copy user repository and paste in the user repository. Now in your OAuth authorization server, we need to implement the custom user detail service. Now user detail service is the default service provided for the users to interact with the Spring Security to check if the user exists or not. So that particular thing we have to customize it to use our database. So we need to create the custom user detail service for that. So let me just create a class that says custom user details service. Custom user detail service, this is the class in the OAuth authorization server, and this is the service, and we will implement this as a transactional. And this particular custom user detail service will implement user details service. This user details service, you can see that is part of the Spring Security. Okay, and there is a method that we need to implement, that is the load user by username. So whatever the username is, for me the username would be my email ID, whatever that we are using. So with the help of the user ID that we have, we need to load the user from the database and we need to pass back to the Spring Security, so Spring Security can handle that user. This is very important step, okay, because without implementing this user detail service, Spring Security will not know about the users that we have in the database. So for this reason only, we had added the user and user repository, entity and repository in our application, copied from the client. So let me just create the object of user repository and I'll auto wire it. Okay, now instead of username, I'll just make it as email so we can understand better. So here let's implement it. We need the user object, that is the what we have added in the entity. Okay, so let me just use this daily code buffer auth server.entity. This user equals to user repository dot find by email. We'll pass the email. Okay, we got the user. Then we will check if user equals to null, then throw new user not found exception, and you can pass no user found. And after that, if so, and now we need to return the user. That user would be of this one, that is the org.springframework.security.core.user details. So this is the user that we need to return back. Okay, and here this particular user needs few details. So let's pass it user.get email, then user.get password. Currently I'm passing everything to true, because if you see this, we need to pass username, password, it's enabled, account non-expired, credentials non-expired, account non-locked. So 1 2 3 4 true. This value I can get from the user itself. So user dot is enabled, rest everything to true. Okay, and the last thing it requires is the authorities. Authorities is nothing in the Spring Security, that what all things that you are authorized to use the resources. It's just as the scopes. Okay, so let's implement the method for that as well. So I'll just implement get authorities method, and here in this authorities I'll pass the list dot of user dot get roles, and this get authorities, let me just create this method, and this is a collection that extends granted authority. Now we need to create this granted authorities. So let me just create the list of granted authorities. Authorities equals to new array list, and for each string role in roles. Okay, let me just rename to roles. I will need to add the authorities. So authorities dot add a new simple granted authority, si simple granted authority, and I need to pass the role, then return authorities. Okay, so let me just add the new over here. Cool, right? You can see that my thought that we did a lot of things, but it's simple. We just created the custom user detail service and implemented the user detail service, which is very important part of the Spring security to load the user based on our database. That's the custom implementation. So we injected the user repository, and this is the load user by username method that we have implemented the method which is taking the email as the input parameter. We got the user from the database. If user is null, then user is not found, exception we thrown. Else we created the user object from this user that we have from the database. So we passed all these details, email, password, enabled, everything. Okay, all these details you can pass from the user. You can add all these details in the database. Okay, and we can handle it. And we got the roles, and based on the roles we created the authorities. Okay, so the user is created. So now this particular user will be part of the Spring security. So whenever we need a user, we'll get directly from here. So your custom user detail service is done. Now comes the other thing, that we need to implement the configuration. We need to add the configuration for our authorization server. So this implementation would be standard for all the authorization servers. So there is a bunch of code where you will be creating the public keys, private keys, and all those stuffs to handle your authorization server, so your clients can connect to it, and the exchange between the authorization code and the token can be happen smoothly. So it's a bunch of standard codes that I'm going to add over here, and I'll try to explain it. So for that, let me create the configuration file. So in the config directory, config package, I'll create the Java class, and I'll say authorization server config. Okay, so this configuration would be basically standard configuration for your authorization server. I'll just add the configuration, and I'll just add proxy bean methods to false. Now there are a bunch of standard implementation that we have to do. So let's add that. We would be needing the password encoder. So I'm just adding the password encoder over here. So now you can see that the bean is not available. So we need to create the bean for it. So let's create the bean for it. So let me go to the custom user detail service itself, and here let me just create the bean. Okay, I'll just use password encoder. I'll just make it a public method. And return new bcrypt password encoder with strength 11, the same thing that we have added in our client as well, and annotate with bean. No fancy stuff. Okay, so now in the authorization server, there it is gone. Now let's add bunch more things. Now we need to add the security filter chain. Okay, so let me just create the bean of it. So here you can see that we have implementing the security filter over here, and we are injecting the HTTP security. So what we want to do for our security, so it's simple stuff. This particular thing, you can see that the OAuth 2 authorization server configuration dot apply default security. So we are applying the default security over here. That means that default OAuth 2 authorization functionality. So default /authorize API /token API, all those default APIs are there, right? For the OAuth 2, all those default APIs will be defaultly added to our configuration. So that's what we have done over here for our security filter chain. Okay, if you go to this particular class, you can see that this is the apply default security that we are calling, and these are the bunch of default configuration is being added over here. Okay, you can see that all the RSA keys and JWT encoder and everything is been defaultly added over here, and we are calling that apply default security. So all those particular APIs are available for OAuth 2. All those default APIs will be enabled. And then what we are doing for this HTTP, we are using the form login and we are customizing this form login for the default. So with the default configuration for OAuth 2, everything will be set up with this line of code. Okay, and we have added the highest precedence for this bean to be used. So if you want to configure any of the APIs for the OAuth 2, then this is the place that you have to configure. But I'm going with the defaults. You should go with the defaults unless there is a specific requirement. Okay, so this is the configuration for that. Now, as we saw earlier, every time the clients were getting registered to the authorization server. So here also we need to register the clients. So client registration also we need to enable over here. We need to add the configuration for it. So let me just add the default basic configuration. I'm just copying this code because this is the standard code. Okay, now there is a lot of things in this method, but don't worry, everything is simple. So here you can see that it is registered client repository. So this is the repository that has been provided for all the clients to get registered. Okay, so if you want your custom implementation, you just have to implement this interface. Okay, it has the couple of methods, that is the save, find by ID, find by client ID. That's it. You just need to implement these methods according to your requirement, according to the database that you are using, or according to any of the things that you are using. If you just implement these three methods to get the particular output or particular return type, that's all good. Okay, so currently I have only one client available. Okay, I am using only one client, that is my Spring Security client. This particular Spring Security client I want to register with my authorization server. So that's why I have just added one client statically over here. Ideally you won't be doing this. These are the static configuration. Okay, if you want to do dynamically, like how we saw earlier, you need to use the JDBC registration client or your custom registration client, where you will be getting all those details, or you will be generating all those details and giving to the user who wants to use your authorization server. I know what I want to use because this is my project, this is my client, and for this client there are details that I am using over here, that I am registering over here, and these details I will give to this client. So this client can connect to the authorization server that I have. Okay, so this is a simple thing. I am creating the object of registered client with random UUID. Okay, and what I'm giving this details, that is the client ID. I'm passing the client ID as the API client, that is the name of my client. So my Spring Security client, this is the name I'll be giving to this Spring Security client. Then I'm giving the client password, that is the client secret. I am encoding the password with the secret. Then client authentication method. So I'm using the client authentication method as the client secret basic. Okay, so whatever the secret information that I am passing over here, with that particular information I'll be able to authenticate my client. These are the grant types that we are allowing. You can see the authorization code, password, refresh tokens. So these are all we are allowing for the client to access through. Then these are the redirect URLs. I will talk about these redirect URLs later. So these are the URLs of your client. So once the authentication or once the authorization is happened from the authorization server, where you want to redirect back. So I want to redirect back to this particular URLs. Now how I got this particular URLs, that I'll tell you like how we got this. These are the standard format URLs that you can define. Okay, so everything I'll tell you later once we implement this, but consider these are the two URLs, redirect URLs. Then I have defined two scopes. Okay, one scope is the OIDC scopes for your OpenID Connect, because we are authenticating as well, and the other scope is read scope, API.read. And then the client settings I have extra added. So what I'm doing is, in the client setting is client settings.builder.require authorization consent. So I am enabling the consent over here, that my authorization server, this server needs to give the consent back to the client to allow. Okay, so it will have the page of the consent as well. If I don't add it, there won't be consent, the consent will be directly given. And I'm building this particular object. Okay, and I'm using the in-memory registered client repository. So this particular registered client will be in the in-memory itself of this particular authorization server. There is one more default implementation added, that is the JDBC registered client repository. If you want, you can directly use that as well, and if you want, you can create your custom implementation as well. As far as I know, there will be only these two implementation by default provided by the Spring Auth server, because there are a lot of databases and there are a lot of implementations available. So you can always go ahead and implement according to your requirement. If you want to use Mongo, Redis, whatever, Cassandra, whatever you want to use, you can implement this particular repository. You can extend this, implement this repository according to the database that you are using to register your clients. I have one, so this is direct. So this is a code to register my client. We will come back for this to redirect URLs later, okay? But rest of the things are clear, that we are giving the authorizations and everything. So how to connect my client to this authorization server. Then now the next thing I required is the public and private key configuration. So let's add the code for that. Okay, here you can see that I've just added this information, but this is nothing but the standard configuration for your public private keys. We just have to create one bean for the JWK source, and we are just creating the RSA key over here. This is the standard. You just need to copy paste it and it will work. You don't have to change anything, okay? Until and unless you have to change the algorithm, like which algorithm that you are using to generate the key. That's it. Rest everything you can directly use it. Now you might be wondering from where I got this code. Got this code from the samples shared by the Spring Security team itself. You go to that repository, Spring Security Auth server, all these particular details are there. So you can directly use from there. This is nothing fancy, just directly use it. You don't have to change anything. You don't have to bother about it, okay? Now the next configuration that you have to do is the provider settings. So provider settings is nothing but the authentication or your authorization provider, auth server provider. So these are the bean configuration for that. So here you can see that I have just defined a bean for the provider settings. Okay, you can see that there are a lot of information, a lot of changes that you can do. We have just defined the issuer. You can change the authorization endpoint, token endpoint, JWK set endpoint. So if you want to configure any of the endpoints over here, you can configure the endpoints. Okay, but by default, the standard endpoints you will get. These are the beans that I have provided. Now you can see that the issuer I have provided is HTTP auth server colon 9000. So if you see 9000, that is the 9000 port of my auth server itself. If you go to the application.yaml, this is my auth server currently, and I have passed the URL for that. So now this particular auth server URL you can define in your host files. Okay, so what you can do is you can go to the terminal, and if you go to cat/private etc host file, okay, and here you can see that this is the host file that if you want, you can change this host file. And here you can see that by default the local host for 127.0.0.1 would be there, and I added one more entry for the host as the auth server over here. That's the only thing that I have implemented. So this is the configuration that you have to add for your auth server to work with that particular URL. So I hope this is clear now. So the configuration for the authorization server is done. Now we need to do the configuration for the basic Spring Security as well for this. So let's add the default Spring Security configuration. So let me just add one more configuration file, and I'll just say default security config. Now you might be wondering, there are a lot of changes and a lot of complex things here, but don't worry, these are very simple, and this you have to do only once. Once this is done, once this is set up, you're good to go always. So this is the default security config, and we need to enable web security, and here I am just adding the configuration. Simple, okay? If you see here, I'm just adding again the security filter chain, and I'm getting the HTTP as the input parameter. What I'm doing, I'm just changing the authorized request. So I'm just doing that all the request coming here has to be authenticated. Okay, any request has to be authenticated with default form login for the authorization server. That's it. Okay, simple thing. Now a lot of configurations are done for the auth server. Very little things are left. So now we have defined the custom user detail service. Like this is the user detail service that you have to use to validate the user. We define the authorization server config, like how the authorization server should work. We also defined how your basic security should work, like all the requests should be validated. So now one thing is left is your authentication provider, like authentication manager, how you should be managing your authentication. So whatever the user object from the custom user detail service I created right from here, now with this particular details, with this user that I have created, I need to validate the credentials that I'm providing from the input. So whatever the input that I'm providing, that has to be validated against this users, right? Whatever the users that I have mentioned. So I need to define the custom authentication provider as well, so that the users are validated against. So let me just create the configuration for that. So let me just create the service, and I'll just say custom authentication provider. I'll annotate this with service, and this custom authentication provider will implement authentication provider. Okay, and we need to implement the method as well, that is the authenticate. Okay, these are the implementations that we have to provide. Now how we can authenticate, we need the custom user details service as well, so whatever we have defined over here. So let me just inject that. Private custom user details service. I'll just auto wire it, and I'll also need the password encoder over here. So let me just auto wire it. Private password encoder. And now this is the authenticate method in which we have to customize it. Okay, so let's do this. So let's get the username password string username equals to, I'll get authentication dot get name string password equals to authentication dot get credentials dot toString. Now user details object we need from the security. User details equals to custom user details service dot load user by username, and here we need to pass email. So email is your username, will get the object of the user details. Let me just make it to user, that is better. Now we need to validate the user. So let me just create the method check password, where you are passing the user and password. Okay, and let's create this method, and this is your raw password. Okay, let's implement this if, let me rename. Okay, check password. I don't know why I make this much spelling mistakes. Okay, now if password encoder dot matches raw password with user dot get password, return new username password authentication token. Okay, where we need to pass user dot get username, user dot get password, and user dot get authorities. Else return new bad credentials exception. Let's say bad credentials. Okay, throw. Simple. So here you can see that we are just authenticating, okay, with the authentication manager over here, and we need to add the support as well. So let me add this. Return username password authentication token dot class dot is assignable from authentication. Okay, so this authentication has been handled over here. So you can see that simple thing, authentication is handled. Now this custom authentication provider we need to bind. Okay, so let's do that. So let me go to the default security and let's bind this over here. Let me create the object private custom authentication provider. Okay, I'll auto wire it, and let me create the bean of authentication manager. Public void bind authentication provider, auto wire it, and I'm just injecting authentication manager builder auth, and this authentication manager builder dot what is the authentication provider, that's the custom authentication provider. Okay, so we just bind this custom authentication provider to our authentication manager builder. That's it. You can see it's simple, looks difficult, but Simple. So now your authorization server is ready. All the configurations are done. It can handle all the requests. Now we have enabled everything. Now we need to register our client. We need to add the configurations in our client to talk to this authorization server. Okay. As every authorization server will give you the details to handle everything in your system, we need to do that. So if you go to this authorization server config, you can see that these are the register client repositories. These are the details that we need to handle. So this is our Spring Security client. Here we need to handle everything in our application.yaml. Currently we have the Spring data source on JPA. Now we need to add for the Spring Security OAuth. So let's add that. I'll just copy the details and I will explain you everything. If I type, there will be some error in the indentation and we might waste a lot of time. So let me just copy the details. After the DDL auto update, I'm just copying every details over here. Okay. So now you can see that it's part of Spring Security OAuth 2 and we are adding the client. Now after this client, these are the custom things now we need to handle. Custom is registration. So this is the name of your client. Okay. We are adding the registration client and the name is API client OIDC. Okay. Provider is Spring. Now this Spring provider I will get into details. The client ID and secret, that is the API client and secret. This is the same thing that we have defined over here. That is the API client and secret. Okay. API client and secret. That is the API client OIDC. Authorization grant type is authorization code. This authorization code we have enabled. You can see that authorization code we have enabled grant type. Then redirect URI. Now this redirect URI is standard. HTTP, your server name, your port, /login, /auth2, /code and registration ID. Your registration ID is nothing but your API client OIDC. Okay. And the same URI, whatever it is configured over here, the standard format you can see over here. Okay. HTTP 1270.0.1 8080 login auth2 code and API client OIDC. That is the client over here that you have defined. Makes sense, right? Now the scope is OpenID for your authentication, as we have implemented, as we have added the OpenID as well, and the client name API client OIDC. And now the below one you can see is for the API client authorization code, where the provider details, client ID and the client secret we have mentioned the same. Authorization grant type is authorization code and the redirect URI is 127.0.1/8080/authorize. Once authorized, this is the redirect API, it will be redirected to. Okay. And the scope we have defined is API.read. So this is the scope that we are going to define, and the same thing we have defined you can see in the authorization server config. You can see that API.read scope, and the other one was OIDC scope.openid. The same thing we have defined over here, that is the OpenID scope. And the provider, you can see the provider Spring issuer URL, it's http:/auth server:9000. If you come back over here, you can see that we have defined the issuer over here, that is the auth server 9000. So the same configuration we have defined over here. Similarly, you can define according to the name that you have given over here. So this is the name. According to the name, everything you have to provide over here. So if you come, you can see these are the two redirect URL you have mentioned over here, that only you have configured. Okay. And this redirect URL is nothing but the standard format that you have to give based on the client ID or the client name that you are giving, registration ID. So this is the configuration. Now the next thing you need to configure is your web security. So if you go to the config, we have created the web security config. Here we have enabled the web security and we have added the security filter change, where for the HTTP we are disabling the CORS and CSRF, and we are adding the authorized HTTP request, and we are permitting all the URLs. This all the URLs we are permitting, but other than that, what all the other URLs we have to be authenticated to go into that. Okay, so let's add that. So I'm adding one more ent matchers /API/anything coming with /API/anything has to be authenticated. Okay, and we need to add the configuration for our auth server as well. Now .auth2 login we need to add. Now for this to work, we need to add the authorization client as a dependency. So let's add the dependency. So I'll go to the Spring Security client and I'll go to the pom.xml file and I'm adding one dependency, and this dependency you can see is for Spring Boot Starter OAuth 2 client. So this will be my OAuth 2 client now. So now if I go back to the web security config, I'll be able to add, let me stop the server and invalidate the cache so everything is refreshing. So I'll give the OAuth to login and OAuth to login, and we need to give the login page, which login page to redirect. So we can define OAuth2.login page, and we need to pass the URL. So the standard URL we need to pass, that is /auth2/authorization/ your registration ID. So whatever the registration ID that you have defined, right? If you go to your application.yaml, that is the API client OIDC. So you will be giving API client OIDC, your login page. .auth2 client customizer with defaults. Okay, with default configuration we are enabling everything. That's it. So this is the configuration that we need to add. Now /API, right? So if you go to the hello controller, so let me just add the /API/hello over here. Okay, so this is the API that we are going to call, and it is just returning hello, welcome to daily code buffer. Okay, so let me just start the OAuth server. So your OAuth server is started, and let me start the client as well. So I started the client as well. Okay, now you can see that it's connected. Let me just go to the browser. Okay, now let's go to the localhost. Let me just open the debugging tool. I'll go to the networks. Let me just close this. Okay, and let me go to the localhost 8080/API/hello. For this, my request should be redirected to the authorization server for authentication. Okay, and here you can see that it has been redirected. Okay, now here I need to provide the authentication. Here you can see that it is redirected to the auth server colon 9000/login page, and here you can see that your hello controller was there, right? Your hello API, it was called and it was sent to the API OIDC. This is a URL. You can see that auth2/authorization/API client OIDC, and you can see that the authorize was called with the response type, client API, client ID, so scope information, state information, redirect URI, everything is passed. The same flow that we have seen with the playground, right? That these are the API, these are the endpoints will be called. Okay, and after that it's been called the authorize. So we need to get authorized. So what I'll do, I will add the details. So if I add any details, okay, and if I try to sign in, you can see that no user found. So this is the particular flow that will happening. So it has to be authenticated. Okay, now if I give the correct information, if I go to the MySQL, okay, if I get the Nikhil over here, okay, if I pass nikhil@gmail.com, and the password for that we had kept was 789. Okay, so if I go back to the browser, okay, if I do 789 and if I sign in, you can see that it has been redirected back. Okay, if I go to the /API/hello, you can see that I'm getting the proper response now. Okay, hello, welcome to daily code buffer. Now if I want to get the logged in user information, that also I can get using the principal. So let me just add that as well. So if I go to the controller, hello controller, and here if I inject the principal object, principal from the java.security, and here I'll just say hello, and I'll just define principal.getName. Let me restart my client. Okay, my client is restarted. Now let's go to the browser. Let me just open the incognito mode, and I'll just do localhost 8080/API/hello. Okay, you can see that I am redirected back to the login page. And if I give the proper information, let me just copy the email ID. Okay, and I'll give the password 789. And if I click on sign in, you can see that I'm redirected back. I'm getting this error because I have not defined this particular endpoint. But instead of this, if I go back to API/user, hello, you can see that I'll get the user as well, that nikhil@gmail.com is signed in. Okay, and as I have defined everywhere as 127.0.0.1 instead of localhost, if I hit this URL instead of localhost, okay, let me just close this. Let me just open the incognito again, and if I hit this, I'll get the login page. Let me just give the Nikhil information over here. And if I do 789, then it should redirect to the correct page. You can see that I'm getting the correct page now, right? It's been redirected correctly. So this way you can see that we have implemented the Auth 2 with OpenID Authorization Server and the client as well. So both of them can interact with each other and only the authorized resources are allowed. Now what if you have a resource server as well? So your resource server is there where only the authenticated user can access those authenticated resources. And if you want to access those resources using your client, how to handle that? So let's create the resource server. Let's create one more application, add into our project, and let's go around how to fetch the data from the resource server as well. So let's try to do that. Let me just close this. Let me go to the start.spring.io. I'll just do com.dailycodebuffer artifact as OAuth resource server, packaging as jar, Java version as 11. Okay, and here what I'll do, I'll just add the web dependency, I'll add the Spring security dependency, and I'll add the auth resource server dependency. Okay, that's it. Let's generate the project and add in IntelliJ IDEA. So let's generate it. Open in Finder, unzip it. Let's copy this. Okay, let's go to IntelliJ IDEA and add as a module in our main project. Let's go to pom.xml file. I'll add the auth resource server and maven reload projects. Here you can see that this is the auth server. Now let's configure the auth resource server as well. So what I'll do, I'll just first change the application.properties to application.yaml, and I'll just do server.port as 8090, and I'll add the configuration for the Spring security as well. So what I'm adding, I'm just adding spring.security.auth2. This is a resource server, JWT, issuer URL is auth server 9000. So this is my issuer URL. So I just configure this as a resource server. Now we need to handle the basic Spring security as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So here with the Java, let me just create the new package, and I'll just say this is a config package. And within this config package, let me just create the Java class, and I'll just say resource server config, and I'll enable the web security. Here we need to create the security filter chain bin. So I'll just define security filter chain, and this is a bean. Now you might have noticed that we have everywhere in all the application we have defined the security filter chain. Okay, and I'll just define the HTTP security. Now we need to configure this as the same way we have configured in our auth server and the client as well. So we'll just define http.mvc matchers. Now all the API request, okay, we are targeting, and it should be authorized request dot mvc matchers /API/ all the API request, and here we need to add the exception. Okay, let's add the exception dot access. We need to provide the access, and it should have the access only. So here you can see that we are calling the method that access only has authority API read. So here you can see that we have defined the scope. Okay, so whenever we are defining the scope for the authority, we need to define as scope underscore and whatever the scope it is. So we are just handling the API read now. If there is multiple, we can add the multiple access over here. So this is the API read that we are defining. Dot and OAuth2 resource server, OAuth2 is a resource server dot JWT. Okay, and we need to return http dot build. Simple. So here you can see that simply we just define the security filter chain where we are authorizing all the requests where scope is API.read. Now let's create the resource or the API for this resource server. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll just create one package, and here I'll just say controller. Inside this controller, let me just create one Java class, and I'll just say user controller. Annotate with REST controller. Okay, and let me create one method public string of array get users return new string, and here I am defining multiple users. Okay, let me just define Shabir, Nikhil, Shivam, and let me annotate with @get mapping /API /users. Okay, you can see that the simple API that we have created. Now suppose this is the API provider, this is the resource server. Okay, and now in your client you want to call this API, but it has to be authenticated, right? It has to be within this scope, whatever the scope we have defined. If you're passing the scope and it's matching with the scope, then only we should be able to get the details. So we need to configure our client to handle the web client. So we'll be using the web client to call this particular URL and to fetch the data. So we need to configure our web client as well. So let's go ahead and do that. If you go to our Spring Security client, and in the pom.xml file, we need to add the dependency of the reactive Spring, as we are going to use the web client. Now this is nothing but you are calling one of the APIs that is behind the authorization server, that is your resource server. You want to call those resources, you want to utilize those resources. To utilize those resources, your web client has to go around, get authenticated, and should get you the data. That's it, right? It's simple as that. Whatever the API that you are directly calling from the client, and if you want to call another API from the another resource server, it has to be authenticated, it has to be within the scopes that you have mentioned, then only you should get the details. So that's what we are trying to implement. So let's add the dependency for that. So let me go to the file over here within the dependency after the OAuth2 client. I am adding two more dependencies, and you can see that it's a Spring Web Flux dependency and Reactive Native dependency. So we can use the web client. So now as we are going to use the web client, we need to configure it as well. So let's go ahead and configure it. We will create the configuration class for that. Now this all things, you can see whatever configuration I'm adding, that is only one-time configuration. So the only challenging thing to understand is that configuration part in the starting. But once you add the configuration, once you get the hang around of it, it's very easy to implement the other things. So as I need to configure the web client, I'll create a new class that says web client configuration. Okay, and I'll annotate with @configuration. Okay, now there is a default configuration. Okay, you can directly add the configuration, so I'll just add the configuration so you can directly utilize it. So here you can see that I've just added the configuration. Let me import all the classes. So okay, I'm sorry, I just added the web client configuration at the wrong place. So let me just delete from here, or let me just Control X from here. Go to the src in Spring Client, in Java config. Here I need to add. Okay, and from the pom.xml file, let me just correct it out if I have done any mistake. No, it's all good. In this POM only I have added. Okay, make sure that if you are working with multiple projects, this type of things happens, this type of issue happens. So make sure that you are adding at the correct place. So you can see that it's just a filter function added and it's applied that web client will be OAuth2 client to configure. Okay, OAuth2 is configured to use. And here you can see that this is the authorization client manager where it is using the authorization code refresh token and all those things. So this is just a default. You can see it's just a default implementation. You just copy all these details, you just enable the beans web client and OAuth2 authorization client manager and you're good to go. You don't have to do anything. Now once this is implemented, we can use web client to call that particular API that we have added in the web in our resource server. Okay, so let's do that. So let's go to the controller, let's go to the hello controller, and here we can call that API. So let's do that. So right here I am creating one method that is public string of users okay, and you can see I'm just passing as a get mapping and /API/users, and here we need to inject OAuth2 authorization client. Okay, and which authorization we need to annotate with registered OAuth2 authorization client. Okay, so we need to bind it. So which particular, so if you go to the client, okay, if you go to the resources application.yaml, this is the one API client authorization code. This is the one that directly we are binding, that it will be using the API client as the client ID, secret, the authorization code, the URL, the scope, all this information for our authentication for our resource server. Okay, so let's go over here and let's define this, that this is the one that we are going to use. Hope so now it is visible. Now we need to use the web client to call that. So let me just auto wire the web client as well. So I'll just do private web client and I'll auto wire it. Now return this dot web client dot get dot URI. So we need to pass the URI. So what would be the URI? This one, http 127.0.0.1:8090. that is the port number that we have defined in our resource server, and /API/user is what we have defined as the endpoint to get the resources. Okay, and then we'll define dot attributes OAuth2 authorized client. Okay, so in the attributes that you have to define is server OAuth2 authorized client exchange filter function. Okay, this is what, if you go to the web client, this is what you have defined, right? So that one we have defined, and let me just do the static import, and here we'll define the client dot retrieve dot body to mono. This is of string array dot class dot block. Okay, so the error I'm getting is because of the attributes. It should be attributes. Okay, it's simple thing. Okay, now this particular method is ready. It is trying to get the data from the resource server that we have defined, and after authorizing, I am getting the data. So now let's start the server. I'll start the OAuth server first. Then let me start the resource server as well. I'm sorry, the resource server only started. Let me start the OAuth server as well, Spring client as well. Okay, so here you can see that everything is started. Now if I want to call the hello controller /API/users, it will try to call this particular resource server that is behind the authorization server as well. After authenticating with the proper scopes only, I'll get the resources. So let me just go to the browser. Let me open the incognito window. I'll just use this /API/hello. Instead of that, I'll just define users. Okay, it should be redirected to the login page as it was intended. Then I'll give the user information and password is 789. And here you can see that it is asking for the consent from the resource server that you should be authenticated. You can see that API client. What is the API client? API client is nothing but your client. If you go to the application.yaml API client, this is your client, right? And what it is asking, you can see that it wants to access your account, that is this one, nikhil@gmail.com. The following permissions are requested. What is it scope? Only we have defined API read, so we'll just give the API read consent and submit the consent, and you can see that I'm getting the data over here. So you can see that my resource server is behind the authorization server. Once the consents are there, after that only I'll be able to access those resources. So that's how the complete flow with the OAuth 2 and OpenID for authorization server, resource server, and the auth client works. So if you want to understand more in depth about everything, I'll add the documentation link in the description below, so you can check that out. I'll also link the different articles where I have read about it. I'll link everything in the description below, so you can check that out. And there are different flows as well, like we just use the authorization code flow. There are different flows also available, so you can try and implement those flows as well, but the fundamentals are same. Just focus on the fundamentals, just try to understand everything and learn accordingly. Ideally there will be very less chances where you will get to implement all this kind of securities, because nowadays there are a lot of third-party tools available like Okta, Auth2.0, like Gmail, GitHub and everything, right? So most of the times people will be using that only, and it is suggested to use it because they have done a lot of work on that. The tools are really good, so we can directly, without worrying everything, we can directly get all those security features. And I'm also not a security expert by any means, but this is what I have understood and I have implemented. And this is also not a particular flow that you will be implementing in the production. There are a lot more extra features, there are a lot more extra configurations that you have to do within this as well to make your application more secure. So this was all about the OAuth 2.0 and how to implement OAuth 2.0 with Spring Security and OpenID Connect in your Spring Boot application. Now if you want to know more about the how to deploy this particular application in the Kubernetes cluster and how to automate the deployment in any of the cloud provider as well, and you want to learn the Kubernetes in depth, then check out these videos on the screen. So go check out, these are really good videos.